Well, I can give a very brief answer. I think it strengthened Keynes' determination to get his theory right. I think he thought he was on the right lines, and that one more push would solve the problems left by the treaties. I think it damaged Hayek's self-confidence enormously. I think it basically led him to give up technical economics. I know that he spent years writing his book on capital, but in a sense, he was moving over to political economy and his theories about knowledge in economics, rather than trying to solve the problems which had been revealed in the reviews of prices and production. So, in the end, Hayek gave up economics in the sense which most people here would understand it to be practiced, and Keynes then became the new economist who's going to lead the world out of depression. Keynes was always more interested in policy, and he was determined to get a theory that could be made politically workable, and that, as Jim Tobin, and Paul Samuelson said in the clip, to lead the world out of depression. I think Keynes was much more convinced that truth was possible in economics than Hayek. I think right at the end of the general theory, he said, in the end, truth will come out and dispel false views. I think Hayek had a surer grasp of the limitations of the subject than perhaps Keynes did.
Did you want to make a comment? You just speak into it.
Is this on? Yes, okay. As far as Hayek goes, I think that certainly his whole goal was to produce a theory that he didn't have the mathematical tools to produce. It would have been a dynamic theory of a capital-using monetary economy. And this is quite complex. And he struggled with it. He tore up, this is all in the correspondence between him and Fritz Machlup. Machlup would say, well, you know, when are you going to send me the next 3 or 4 chapters of your book? He says, I'm going to have them to you in a couple of months. And then he says, sends a letter, I've torn it all up. I'm going to start all over. And he did this 35 and 36. Now, at that same point in time, he starts to participate in the socialist calculation debate, which is a totally different set of issues, and is when he starts to develop his ideas about knowledge and how does a system coordinate when knowledge is dispersed. And at the same time, he's also, we see this in letters to Walter Lippmann in 36 and 37, starting to conceptualize this grand project called the Abuse of Reason Project, where it's intellectual history and its attempt to trace the evolution through time and through different countries of the twin ideas of what he calls scientism and socialism. So Hayek, I think I disagree that he lost his confidence. He was a very confident man. He was operating on lots of different problems, but I think he was completely frustrated about trying to deal with the problem that he initially dealt with in prices and production and monetary theory in the trade cycle.
I just add, which I think Lord Skidelsky will agree, that by the summer of 31, by the time that the treatise was published, Keynes was already quite dissatisfied with it, and the Cambridge Circle had already really begun to assemble, and the conversation that led to the general theory was already underway, of course beginning with a simple problem, challenge, opportunity that the treatise assumes full employment. It assumes a stable and full employment level of output, when obviously this was not the case in the world around them, and the work that was already going when Keynes got the review from Hayek and from others. There was a lot of dissatisfaction about the treatise. It clearly was not what he had originally set it out to construct.
I've always, could I just make one, to just comment on, I've always thought it was a tragedy that, for political economy, that Keynes died when he did. Whether he would ever have had the leisure to take up the challenge of the road to serfdom, you can see the elements of the challenge in his letter to Hayek, when he said, basically, the basic issue is how do you best maintain a free society? Do you actually, is government intervention important to protect freedom against its wreckers? Or can you allow the market as much scope as Hayek seemed to want it? It would have been a great debate, and it never happened.
Just to add one final bit on that, part of the criticism that Keynes offered was that, well, you've told us what's wrong with socialism, but how do you decide between good intervention and bad intervention in the economy, since you're acknowledging that there should be some intervention? And I think Hayek took this seriously, and of course his next major book was The Constitution of Liberty, which tries to articulate the general principles for a liberal society.
Okay, the next questioner was right there.
Hi, my name's Steve Ramirez from Loyola University Chicago School of Law. And I want to pick up on this comment that was just made about Keynes, because I think, from my humble perspective, it seems like Keynes is clearly right that the government needs to fill the hole. And yet, Hayek is clearly right that the more expansive the role of the government is, the more likely it is to be overrun by concepts of public choice. And in the general theory, Keynes talks about a rather comprehensive socialization of investment, and he even goes so far as to posit that ultimately we end up with an end of scarcity for capital. And to me, this is a very open-ended vision for the role of government in the economy, and given what we just saw in the subprime crisis with respect to the role of special interests and those with concentrated economic power, I'm wondering if any thinking has been done to reconcile this tension between the need for government presence in one form or another and the need to control it, I would say, through law from special interest subversion.
Well, I think you've got to always remember that Keynes was dealing with a particular problem, not with all of the problems of capitalism. He was dealing with a problem of instability and tendency for an economy to operate at a very suboptimal level if unattended to. So his interventions were quite limited, and he didn't want to supersede the system. There would be large scope for markets that would continue. By socialization of investment, he meant roughly public-private partnerships. I think that's the analogy, the best way of thinking about them. That derived from all his work on liberal politics in the 1920s, when public-private partnerships, private-public partnerships were all the vogue in middle way thinking. And basically those ideas have became very fashionable again in the 1990s and at present. He didn't believe in nationalization. He thought that was largely irrelevant. The ownership of the particular industry he didn't think was important. It was how do you best stabilize investment so that you avoid the volatility of the marginal efficiency of capital, as he put it. And he thought that those public-private partnerships, what he calls socialization of investment, would steady investment and prevent these big fluctuations. So I think he thought of it in that way. Right at the end of the general theory, he said if the level of aggregate demand can be kept controlled, then there is nothing to be said against our classical analysis of how markets allocate and distribute resources. So I think you've got to think of it as a very limited program, but directed to much the most central problem of the day.
Okay. I have a question up front. Anybody else over here? No, that's a quiet side. In the far back, if you could take a microphone there. But first, we'll take the one up front.
I want to ask a question which is related to something that's already going on today, which is the issue of the role of the theory of competition in these different conceptions of capitalism. We all know the theory of perfect competition, but I wonder if you could speak to the differences between Keynes and Hayek about what competition does and what its consequences are for the aggregate economy.
Hayek had a paper called The Meaning of Competition, which I suggest that you have a look at. It was published in 1946 and appears in his collection, Individualism and Economic Order. For the Austrians, competition is not perfect competition. Competition is something that takes place outside of equilibrium. It's rivalry. Austrians have this phrase, the theory of consumer, there's no choice in the theory of consumer choice, and there's no competition in the theory of competition. And I think it's getting at the problem of equilibrium theorizing that they objected to. So,
just one footnote. Keynes was more tolerant of size than I think we would find comfortable today. He thought that he liked concentrations because he thought the power of such concentrations, industrial concentration, had been robbed of much of its sting by the divorce between management and ownership. And he thought management was more inclined to take a public interest view, and that was also true of the larger the corporation. He thought it would serve the public interest better, and also I think he thought its investments would be more stable and directed towards longer term concerns than that of very competitive private enterprise. I think he grossly underestimated the power of institutions, and particularly their power to suborn politics. It's not just their power in the market. And that's why I think that debate about concentration, I think, is very, very relevant to what you do about the banking system today. Whether you're a trust buster, as liberals would tend to be, and therefore a Glass-Steagallite in a way, or whether you feel that you can you can regulate them without changing their structure. And I'm not sure. I think Keynes would have probably been a regulator, I'm afraid. And I'm instinctively a trust buster and believe in narrow banking.
Okay, no, I guess this does work. All right. I think it's fair enough that there's a spectrum here in the sense that between Keynes and Hayek, I imagine most of us fall on this continuum, and those who don't are probably fairly thin on the ground. But my question would be, this probably says more about how you vote than how you think. And in terms of moving forward and restructuring economics as a profession, how do we mediate between the two extremes or the two competing explanations? Is it about, on the one hand, the internal logic and internal coherence of the theories? Is it about their elegance? Is it about their ability to account for the past, their ability to cure the present, the ability to predict the future? Or is it ultimately what Dr. Caldwell was saying, in a sense of the failure of narrative and competing explanations, and the idea that this is actually an object lesson in methodology, in that if we are going to use this as a starting point moving forward, where do we focus the lens in terms of the attention we put on what we can draw from this debate?
I think you've just asked, what are we all doing here? And I think that the next 2 days will move us a little closer to an answer. Perhaps this is a good one for the last session. Well, that's my opinion.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know, there's got to be some serious dialogue, I think, between the Austrians and various schools of Keynesians. I think they can't just inhabit their separate encampments and fire shots at each other. The enemy is too strongly entrenched, if I may put it that way, in the central position. I think one of the things we've got to decide is whether we need to take uncertainty seriously. I thought that is a key position. I think Lucas's genius, in a way, was to abolish uncertainty. I mean, he abolished time. I mean, his models sort of got round a problem that had sort of obsessed economics for 100 years or more, which is how do you deal with time? And there's no time. It's gone. And of course, that's very, very attractive, because you've just eliminated one of the key issues which economists talked about and found intractable. And I think one's got to reintroduce that, but at the same time recognize that if one does so and chooses to theorize with time and money sort of in central positions, the role of maths in economics is going to shift. And I believe it's going to be less important. But I don't know how you get there. I think this is the start of a big intellectual research effort. I don't believe you're going to come up with ultimate conclusions. Economics cannot progress in the way that natural sciences at least purport to. Just because the future's too open-ended.
I'd just like to add just one last thing. We may be using the word differently, but my perception of the Austrians is that uncertainty is actually quite important to them in the Knightian sense, that they don't want to deal with models of risk, but genuine uncertainty.
It's complexity, is it that they concentrate on?
Well, it's just that one of the parts of what a dynamic market process does is it throws up surprise and novelty, true novelty, and that you can't, that this is one of their, that information is different from knowledge. Information over which you can search and have probability estimates of when the optimal stopping point might be is quite different from their perception of what markets do, which is constantly surprise. This is why I mentioned the Schakelian connection. And indeed, post-Keynesians and Austrians 20 years ago, actually there was quite an active dialogue, both rather, dialogue between heterodox groups, essentially, is what that comes to.
Could I just ask, why do markets constantly surprise in the Austrian view?
Because the world is constantly changing and new things are happening. The internet occurs.
We're changing.
We make contracts today, whether it's to buy machine goods or build factories or invest in research and development, and the output of them comes good under circumstances that we neither could know nor could effectively hedge against.
It's actually
at the time the contract was written.
It's the Popper point that you can't predict future knowledge.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Now I think that is a profound basis for a conversation that could be very productive.
I agree.
And on that note, I think we'd like to thank the speakers.